So at this point in time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Amanda Irwin, who works with organisations to build their capabilities, including climate and nature-related literacy. Amanda has a very impressive research profile and teaching profile, and she also has extensive experience working with corporates across all stages of their sustainability journey. So over to you, Amanda. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Fiona. So what we'll start off with is discussing risk management in the overall context of the AASB reporting standards. So I think yesterday you were taken through the overall framework here. There are 4 key pillars. Yesterday you talked through governance and metrics and targets. This afternoon we're going to talk through strategy and risk management. But we're going to do them in reverse order because risk management is actually the pivotal disclosure that all the other elements hang off. So we're going to dive into understanding what's expected to be disclosed under risk management, and then we'll have a second session understanding what's expected to be disclosed under strategy. So the objective of the risk management disclosures is that a user of general purpose financial reports would understand for an entity what are the processes that they use to identify, assess, prioritize, and monitor climate-related risks and opportunities. There's quite some detailed components of those disclosures, which we won't go through in a whole lot of detail, but I have done a little bit of separating them out into what's required when looking at risks and what's required when looking at opportunities. And you'll see there that there's less needed for the disclosures under opportunities. It's just understanding the processes that were used to identify those opportunities. But of course, you can also disclose the things that are required under risks, under the opportunities. So let's have a look at what's required for disclosure under risks. First one is the inputs and parameters used for the risk assessment, how the nature, likelihood, and magnitude of the effects of risks are assessed by the entity, how climate-related risks are prioritized relative to other types of risks. So the prioritization is the important thing here, and how climate-related risks are monitored. Underneath that, broader disclosures are around whether a scenario analysis was used and how it informed the identification of those risks and opportunities, and how the processes that were used for identifying, assessing, prioritizing, and monitoring climate-related risks and opportunities are integrated into the entity's overall risk management process. So you'll see there's 2 places where other risks are mentioned in the disclosures. The first one in this green box is how those risks are prioritized to every other risk that the entity has identified. And the second one is how those risks are incorporated, how the processes for identifying those risks are incorporated into the overall risk management process. So at this point, it might be helpful to understand the definition that the AASB is relying on for climate-related risks and opportunities. So here are the definitions that it includes for climate-related risks and for climate-related opportunities. And risks are really considered in the AASB is very, very similar consideration around financial risks. So we're talking about risks from climate change that could impact the financial performance of a company. They give you some examples of what some of those risks might be, but ultimately we're looking at things that, if they materialize, could carry financial implications for the entity. On the other hand, opportunities are those that represent potential positive effect for the entity. And they're very clear to point out that often the work that is done in identifying risks or adjusting or mitigating risks can help to identify business opportunities as well. So we don't want to lose sight of those 2 things. Sometimes it feels like a lot of work in the risk identification, but actually the work that's done to identify those risks can help to uncover opportunities. Now, you might be asking, okay, what are climate-related risks? What are we talking about here? And the AASB uses the same definitions that are used in the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is abbreviated to the TCFD. I've included a link here for reference because they actually have more detail around what these are than exist in the standards. But climate-related risks are divided into 2. We have transition risks and physical risks. Transition risks are associated with the transition of the global economy to a low-carbon economy. So it's all the things that might happen as the world seeks to transition to a low-carbon economy. So that might include things like policy or regulatory changes. And we're actually at the point where one of those transition risks has materialised for us here in Australia. Because that regulatory change has happened, we now have legislation around climate-related financial disclosures. There's also the risk of litigation. As more and more people become aware of climate change and consider that businesses should have understood the impacts on their business of climate change, there's the risk of litigation happening there. There's a market shift. So as the economy transitions to a low carbon economy, the existing markets will change. Car manufacturing is probably a really good example of this, where, 30 years ago, it was only internal combustion engines being manufactured, but now we have a significant part of the market in electric vehicles. And the last transition risk is tied up around reputation. So the way that an entity responds to climate change or the impacts of climate change, or discloses its targets, discloses its emissions, can all be tied up with that entity's reputation. So it's a very brief overview of what transition risks are. Physical risks are the impact or the risk of an impact to the organisation from the actual effects of climate change. And these are divided into two. So we take physical risks and we divide them into two. We have acute physical risks and chronic physical risks. And acute physical risks are those associated with a particular event. So examples of acute climate-related risks are bushfires or extreme flooding, extreme weather or flooding. So they have an impact at the location that they happen, they have a start and they have an end. The frequency of them might increase, but they happen at one point in time. Chronic physical risks are those associated with changes to the climate over a longer period of time. So this is where things like rising sea levels, increased temperatures, and water scarcity come in. So they are physical risks, but they are chronic physical risks. Opportunities, on the other hand, there's actually a great range of opportunities that the TCFD identifies. I can get my slides to work. There we go. Sorry. There's five potential climate-related opportunities that the TCFD identifies, all to do with changes that an entity might make to adjust to the impacts of climate change. So one of them might be resource efficiency. So that might be changes to the way an entity uses products, changes to what it throws out, and that might result in efficiencies in other ways. So it might help if we do more recycling or use more recycled goods. That's helping from a climate transition point of view, but it's potentially also reducing costs for the entity. Changes to the energy source. This is one that most organisations take as a low-hanging fruit. Often moving to renewable energy sources reduces costs. If they're dependent on fuel, that can really help in terms of reducing the price volatility. Petrol prices go up and down, and needing to forecast for those changes becomes quite problematic. So there can be some opportunities in not needing as much fuel from that point of view. And of course, reputation. So moving towards renewable energy sources is often seen as a really good thing to be able to present in terms of a company's climate-related action plan. Another opportunity might be introducing new products and services. There might be new product opportunities, might be able to electrify something that you already make, and also presents the opportunity to diversify a product offering as new markets open up, which is the next opportunity in terms of new markets that might open up in a transition to a low carbon world. And here's the other side of the car manufacturing. So electric vehicles is really opening up as a strong market. So it gives, if you're a car manufacturer and you can adjust your manufacturing to be able to deliver electric vehicles, that presents new market opportunities. And the other market opportunity might be policy incentives. Some states, territories, countries will introduce policy incentives to help lead the transition to a low carbon economy. And so entities that can get on top of those opportunities can really take advantage of them. And then the final opportunity that the TCFD identify is around resilience, that taking advantage of these climate-related opportunities can build an organisation's resilience. And that might be through diversifying supply chains, so making sure that there are suppliers from different regions or different jurisdictions involved. And also there's a strong move towards green finance, so financing for organisations that can demonstrate their green credentials or their ability to move to a low carbon operating model can get hold of financing that other entities won't be able to do. So there's a brief overview of what we're talking about when we're mentioning climate-related risks and climate-related opportunities. Of course, all of this needs to be built into the context of materiality. So the AASB disclosures are not expecting every entity to declare every single risk that they've identified or every single opportunity that they've identified. What they're looking for is material risks and material opportunities. I thought this might be helpful to keep in perspective of what they mean or how they assess materiality or how they are expecting companies to assess materiality. And it's really expected to be consistent with financial reporting. All this sustainability reporting and carbon-related financial disclosures are being tied in to those financial reports. And so the concept here is the way that you think about materiality from a finance point of view or a risk to the business point of view is the same approach that you should take to materiality for climate-related risks and opportunities. And I've popped there, in case you're interested in further reading, there's a lot of commentary on the new Act here in this explanatory memorandum, which can also give some additional perspective. So that's a bit of background about climate-related risks and opportunities. I think you're probably all wondering, how do I go about identifying and assessing those climate-related risks and opportunities? So let's start with risks. The process is actually very similar for identifying opportunities. They generally pop up as you go through the risk process. So here's a very simple diagram to think about the steps that you can go through to identify and assess climate-related risk. And I've broken that into direct, identifying and assessing direct risk, so risk to the operations of the entity in question, and then indirect risks, which are risks that materialize elsewhere but will have an impact on that company's operations. And that's normally in the supply chains or value chains or in an investment situation in the investee companies. So the steps for a direct assessing and identifying and assessing direct risk are to get information that the company already knows, information about the company, in particular, the locations of operations. So the first step is to identify where your entity has operations. Once that's identified, the next step is to go and find information from other sources, usually, or you may have internal sources as well, to give you some information about those locations in terms of the physical and transition risks that are likely to materialize. So the first step was getting information internally. The second step is going externally and getting information to help you. And the third step is then overlaying the two of those. So once you know where your locations are and you have information about physical or transition risk at each of those locations, you're able to start assessing the intersection there and working out what the impact is. On the indirect side, it's actually the same process, getting information internally on what are the commodities that we are dependent on or the key players in our supply chain, or in the case of a financial services company, the investment profile or the lending profile. Again, that's information that is held in all those organizations. We then do the same thing. We go and look externally for information about those commodities and sectors, either the ones that are directly in our supply chain or the ones that we are investing in or insuring. Once we've got that information, we then overlay those two things again so that we can assess the intersection of that impact. And I know I make it sound really simple and it's not necessarily that easy to get the information. The first step is the most important step in terms of understanding what are the direct locations of operation for an entity, and then what are those commodities, supply chains, or investment profile of the entity, because that's the starting point for assessing risk. So then to give us a sort of real life example of going through and doing this, I would like you to come on a journey with me. I'd like it to be a little bit interactive. No, that's not necessarily super easy here, but we are going to pretend that we are looking at a risk assessment profile for Acme mining machinery. And so this is the information that we know from Acme, the first step here, identifying the location of operations and identifying the dependencies and commodities that they rely on. So Acme is a manufacturing company that supplies bespoke machinery for coal mining operations. It's based in Queensland and it has 3 operational locations. It has a head office in the Brisbane CBD. It has a manufacturing facility in Rockhampton. and it has a distribution centre in Townsville. And just to help you picture this a little bit, I've popped a map. I know that will be very hard for you to see. It's a map of where all the coal basins are in Queensland. So we can see here down towards the bottom, we have a group, and then up the middle here, we have some. And so the manufacturing facility in Rockhampton is kind of in the middle here to be able to supply the Australian coal mining locations. The distribution centre is up here in Townsville, so it can reach far north Queensland operations and also has access to the port at Townsville to send those coal mining machines elsewhere. So there are 3 operational locations. We've also got information on the key inputs to production of that mining machinery. And they are steel for making the components, electric components for making all the bits move. And ACME has been under pressure for a while from its customers, and they would like to see electrified machinery wherever possible because that's part of their climate-related transition plan. And so ACME has been doing work to start to electrify some of its machinery, and it's relying on lithium-ion batteries to do that. So we've gone through the first step there of identifying the information that we know about our own entity here. So we're all part of ACME mining machinery. Step 2 was going away and getting information that we could overlay on our own locations. And let's start with the physical risk. Let's start with information on the physical risk of both those locations and the supply chains and value chains. So I'm going to use real life information from publicly available sources in Australia. I'm not going to use comprehensive information because we don't have a whole lot of time today. But I have picked up a couple of key things that will contribute to climate-related risk for an entity in Queensland. And the first one here is Queensland flood information. This is put together by the Queensland government. I've done a couple of layers on this map, and those red circles represent 3 locations. So here we have Townsville, furthest north, Rockhampton, kind of halfway down, and then the Brisbane CBD. And the colours here represent historical flooding levels and or flood studies that the Queensland government has done. And so we can see from here, again, very rudimentary analysis, that all 3 of our locations have had flooding activity in the past. So that is a risk. It will probably materialise in the future. We have information to say that it has materialised in the past. In the case of Townsville, only a couple of weeks ago. So we know that that is a risk based on this information about the location. The second bit of information that I've picked up from is the climate risk map that the Climate Council here in Australia does. And what this gives us is an assessment of locations around Australia on their exposure to different types of climate risk. And you can see here on the bottom that we can get this information by suburb, by local government area, and by electorate. We can pick 3 different emission scenarios, low, medium, and high, and we can pick 3 different years, 2030, 2050, 2100. And we've got 5 different climate risks that we can map as well. I've decided to map bushfires because I'm, again, doing a very simplistic analysis. And what this shows me is, and I haven't picked up Brisbane, but for Townsville and Rockhampton, these 2 circles, the risk of a bushfire activity increasing by 2030 is pretty small. So there's 0 to 2% of properties are at medium to high risk of bushfires. Oh, I can see I have a question. Let me see. We have a question. Can we map extreme wind given cyclone-prone region in the north? That is such a good question, Belinda, that when I click on this slide, we'll have a look at another example. Some more data that's available to us from publicly available sources. So this one is taken from the Bureau of Meteorology. Again, very simplistic, and I've just done a high level I think there's 48 years of data behind here, and you can pick El Nino and La Nina events and see what those differences look like. There's actually a lot more information on cyclones there as well. And what this data is showing us is where tropical cyclones generally originate from around Australia. So that shows us that up here at about 20 degrees south, which is pretty much where Townsville is, every year there's kind of 0.6 of a cyclone happening and originating out here. Slightly worse if we're over in the Pilbara up there in northwest WA. So we've got some idea of historically how likely are cyclones to form off the coast of North Queensland. Now, of course, we've got some really great, and these are great examples. There's one forming off the coast of North Queensland right now, but there is information that you can get from the Bureau of Meteorology that helps you understand those things. So I've just picked up 3 bits of information there on those 3 locations. So now this is where I would love the interactive, because I know it's very difficult when we're in a webinar setting. I'd love for some participation via a Mentimeter survey. And so what you can do here is if you take your phone and read that QR code, it should take you to our Mentimeter presentation, which gives you an opportunity to engage in the questions. And I would point out that there's no right or wrong answer. We are not checking, we don't know. None of us actually know. That's the whole point of risk assessment and identification. We don't really know, but based on all the information we have in front of us, what I'd like you to do is rank the physical climate-related risks in terms of the likelihood that they will intersect with ACME's direct operations. So just based on the data that we have or other data that you're aware of, do you, in terms of the ranking, and again, it doesn't matter, not right or wrong, do you expect that there will be increased frequency and or duration of drought, increased frequency of extreme weather events such as cyclones, increased frequency and or intensity of bushfires, and increased frequency and or peak of flooding? So I'm now, hopefully the technology works for me. I'm going to go and have a look. There we go. This is what's coming up. Thank you, guys. Love it, all this participation. We've got a bit of a battle for first in terms of the increased frequency of cyclones and the increased frequency and or peak of flooding. We've got droughts catching up and bushfire is coming at the end there. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that all of those climate-related events won't happen. But it does mean, based on the data that we've had a look at, where probably the cyclones or the flooding are probably the most likely to impact Townsville and Rockhampton and the CBD in terms of our operations. So there are likely to be bushfires, there are likely to be drought, but based on what we know about ACME, the operations, the direct operations are sitting there in Townsville and in Rockhampton, and we know for a fact that there has been flooding and there are cyclones in those 2 places. Great. Thank you for the participation. I've got more questions for you, so we'll keep going. But this is great to have the engagement. Thank you. Next question for you then is, if we've identified that those are the likely physical climate-related risks for ACME, if we now turn it back to ACME's operations, we think about the fact that they have 3 locations. I want you to think now about short-term operational disruptions. So this is not necessarily saying that there wouldn't be disruptions from all of those things in all of those locations. But in terms of the significance to the business operations of the 3 locations, so the head office in Brisbane, manufacturing facility in Rockhampton, and the distribution centre in Townsville, which location do you think is most likely to contribute to short-term operational disruptions? So let me move my slides so you guys can start answering that question. Hopefully that that should move on your device. Here we go. We've got a few dots coming through. Thank you. You can pick more than one answer. Again, there isn't a right or wrong answer here. Cool. Okay. We've got bigger cluster around Townsville. All 3 locations are potentially going to see disruption. But I think we're kind of collectively thinking it might be the distribution centre in Townsville. We've also got impacts in the manufacturing facility in Rockhampton and head office CBD. I guess in terms of short-term operations, the head office in the Brisbane CBD would be a hassle if people couldn't do their work there. But as long as the machinery can still be made and can still be distributed to customers, probably not as big a disruption as it would be if the distribution couldn't happen. The manufacturing facility obviously is going to be disruptive, but potentially not in the short term if there's enough inventory. So if the manufacturing goes on hold for a couple of weeks, probably okay. If the distribution, if Townsville is flooded again and there's no road, no ability to get in or out, the only distribution that would be able to happen would be through the port, as long as the trucks can get from the distribution centre to the port. So we're starting to see that with just a very, very simplistic level of information, we can begin to pull together information on physical risks. Let's do one more. Back. Sorry, now let's start thinking. Let me stop and see if anyone wants to put a question in the chat around those physical risks. So that assessment of physical risks using that really simplistic identify location, identify external data, and then do the intersect. The next thing I want to talk about is the indirect or the value chain dependencies. So please feel free to put a question in the chat. If not, I'll keep going. And if you do have a question, please do pop it in the chat at any time, and I'll try and look at that as we go through and continue to talk about the risks. So now let's think about those risks from the value chain point of view. So we mentioned, but the information that we got at the beginning was that there were 3 key ingredients to production for Acme mining machinery. One of them is steel for the components. The other is batteries for the electrification of the machinery, and the electronic components to help the machinery work. Now, if we do one sort of layer, sort of product layer decomposition here, we know information about how steel is made. So steel is made, we need iron ore and we need coking coal. Batteries, lithium-ion batteries depend on lithium, and electronic components are depending on silicon. So we've got there the information that tells us what are some of the key commodities that Acme is dependent in its value chain. What we've looked at there is the supply chain, but you'll see there's a feedback loop there because Acme is dependent on coking coal in its supply chains, and Acme also is dependent on the coal mining industry for its business operations. So we have a very simplistic map here, but we can see those intricacies already. And so when we're doing that risk assessment, we want to be able to rely on those intricacies. I'm not going to go through the whole lot of detail of the supply chains that sit behind here, but we could imagine that the mining sector is actually a really important contributor to Acme's production processes. So it's relying on mining operations happening in various locations to mine iron ore, to mine coal, to mine lithium, and to mine silicon. So each of those sectors rely on mining. They also rely on a whole lot of other sectors, and I'm not going to try and pull them out, but that will include things like the transport sector to move the products around and the insurance sector. Now, of course, Acme is also dependent on the transport and insurance sectors as well. And so its value chain is not just through the commodities that it's using, but also through all the goods and services that it's buying. So that's a very rough mud map of the value chain dependencies for Acme mining. So now we're up to the stage where we want to go and get external data to help overlay on top of that value chain. And very conveniently, PwC has written a climate risk report where it has identified the climate risk to 9 key commodities, and 2 of the ones that we're reliant on are in there. So this data is looking at a low emissions scenario at the year 2050. So it's a little bit more long-term than what we were looking at the direct operations. If we look at the iron is a commodity that is needed for the steel that Acme needs to make the machinery. This data is telling us that 62% of production capacity of iron ore is expected to be exposed to significant high or extreme heat stress. And over here, we can see that 74% of production capacity for lithium is expected to be exposed to significant high or extreme drought risk. And we get a little bit of an insight into why when we look at this other chart here, because this shows us the locations that contribute to the global output. And so for iron, Australia represents just under 50% of global production. And for lithium, we represent just over 50%. So this gives us an understanding of why iron and lithium are going to be exposed to those 2 climate-related risks, because a lot of the capacity is coming from Australia, which we know is going to be exposed to those risks. So that's some information that helps us work out those climate-related risks. So I'm going to ask for some participation again based on that. And again, no right or wrong answer, and I potentially may have given the answer away, but on that information and understanding Acme's really simplistic supply chain or value chain, do you think there are any climate-related risks that could materialize in Acme's value chains by 2050? Let me pop over to our Mentimeter and move us to the next slide so you guys can start inputting your thoughts. 4 options there, not really. very unlikely, possible but not likely. There will likely be some impact, and there will probably be a significant impact, and ACME should start planning now. Right. Looks like we're converging on the C and D option. I would say, again, we don't know a whole lot of information, but it is very likely, it's quite likely that there will be an impact. There would be a few things that would need to change for it only to have some impact. There's likely to be a significant impact if the value chains continue to operate the way they are. If ACME continues to rely on steel that has been mined, so sort of virgin steel, then it is going to, we could confidently say that there is going to be a significant impact on their value chains or their supply chains, because we know that iron ore production is going to drop. Oh, sorry, but what we know is that a big chunk of iron ore production is going to be exposed to extreme heat events, and we know the jurisdiction, which is Australia, and so we can overlay the fact that there are work health and safety laws in Australia that say when temperatures get above a certain level, organisations should really pay attention to whether their workers are working in unhealthy conditions. So that's not to say that there might not be mining operators in Australia that will continue to operate on very extreme heat days. Likely scenario is that there will be a reduction in output by 2050 because of those extreme heat days. Let me stop and see if there are any questions here in terms of those physical risks. I have one example of a transition-related risk. So let me see if anyone has any questions there. While you're thinking of your questions, I'll also just point out that you may not be lucky enough to have a PwC report around the key commodities for your business or the key sectors that intersect with your business. But if you do use Fair Supply's platform, their supply chain page that they have, which I've a screenshot here, gives you some insight into the supply chain connections that sit behind where your money goes. So this is a demonstration account, but it shows us each of these three here at tier 1 give us information about which sectors are receiving the money through the supply chains, and then we can see which sectors they're connected to here to be able to pull those supply chains together and deliver that product. So if you're not lucky enough to have great information, I would suggest that you go and have a look at this supply chain slide on the Fair Supply platform. I'll have a question from Jennifer. I don't know, technical team, can we unmute? I'm not sure how to do that. Maybe let me see if I can from here. No. Jennifer, maybe if you can pop your question in the chat, because I'm not sure how that's going to work. Oh, okay. Yep, I've seen it in the Q&A. Let me give it a try there. For professional services organisations, are we then risk assessing our customers in terms of their exposure? And so I'm assuming that you're talking about a delivery of a service. So if that is the case, rather than a financial services organisation where money is being invested or lent, for professional services organisations, your customers are part of your downstream value chain. So if they are a significant impact on your business model, then it would be worth including them in the risk assessment, simply because if they are very exposed to climate related risks and they go out of business, your customer base will shrink as well. So that's how to think about that. And I guess one of the key things which I haven't yet spoken to is the materiality of that risk. And so once all those risks are identified, you would kind of rank them against each other and think through if this is a significant risk to us. So if a big chunk of our customers are likely to go out of business because of the climate related risks that they're exposed to, we probably want to diversify our business model so that we have a broader customer pool and it won't matter so much. So I hope that answered your question. Just check in the chat. Great. Okay, thank you. Let me keep going and we'll talk about transition risks just briefly, and then I will see if there are any other questions coming through. So we've moved from physical risk to let's start thinking about transition events. And just recapping where we were up to with transition risks was about the move to a low carbon economy. So I've put here some hypothetical / real examples of things that might change in the move to a low carbon economy. And now I'd love for you guys to have a guess or assessment of whether you think each of these transition events are likely to be a risk or an opportunity. So the first one here is that China announces the shutdown of all coal-fired power generation by 2030. The second one, which did happen last week, is that the Australian Prime Minister announces a $2 billion bailout of Whyalla Steelworks, and that steelworks will be focused on green steel. And green steel is one that uses less coal in the production process. Third one is that the Queensland government announces an increase in royalties for coal mining. And the fourth one is that the Queensland government announces a decrease in royalties for coal mining. Now, that fourth one isn't actually conducive to a transition to a low carbon economy, but it is something that could happen. So let's move across to the Mentimeter and give you guys a chance here. What I'm thinking is, if you think it's a risk, pop your slider on the left-hand side. If you think it's an opportunity, pop your slider on the right-hand side. If you think it could be either a risk or an opportunity, pop your slider in the middle there. Okay, we've got some coming through. Okay, how are we going? We've got 6 participants. Give it a little bit more time for everybody to join in. Looks like the key one that's moving towards the opportunity side is the government's bailout of the Whyalla Steelworks. The other 3 are leaning more towards risk. Some people see them as part of an opportunity. Yeah, they've probably got enough answers there. So my thinking on the China one, which of course is not necessarily the correct thinking, is that if China announces the shutdown of all coal-fired power generation by 2030, there's less of a market for coal. Now, there might be another opportunity that opens up, but if China is not buying coal, then it's likely that less people are going to be mining coal because the market has shrunk. So if that was the case, that would be a transition risk for ACME. The second one here, I think, is probably could be a risk or an opportunity. So if Whyalla Steelworks focuses on green steel, that means there's less coal used in the production process. So again, the coal mining market could shrink. But it also means that the steel that ACME is then able to buy is more green. So it potentially represents a risk in terms of the market size, but it represents an opportunity in the ability for ACME to source steel that is more climate friendly. And so that would be something that it could talk about in its climate transition plan, that it is starting to source steel from steelworks which are lower carbon or less carbon intensive. If the government announced an increase in royalties for coal mining, that would be something that would make coal mining a more expensive proposition. And so that could potentially reduce the output of coal mining in Queensland, might not reduce the output of coal mining in New South Wales or in other countries, but it would probably reduce the output of coal mining in the locations that ACME is close to. So potentially a risk. If the government announces a decrease in royalties for coal mining, that means that it's cheaper for entities to mine coal in Queensland. So that likely would turn into a market opportunity for ACME in terms of more people expanding their coal mines and using ACME's equipment. So there again, there's no right or wrong answer, but this is the thought process to go through when working out how to go through and think about transition risks and what likely impact there are on different businesses. Let me stop there and see if we have any more questions on identifying and assessing those physical and transition climate-related risks. Any other questions? Oh, no, looks like not quite. Oh, and I've got one in the chat. Let me have a look at that. Could some pose chronic physical risks? Yes, there are things that would pose chronic physical risks, and we'll actually talk to them when we get to the strategy and talk through scenario planning in more detail. But that would be things like rising sea levels. So rising sea levels is a chronic physical risk, and so we'll have a look when we do our strategy session on the impact that that has on these particular operations. Yeah, and Jennifer has also said a comment. We will have to put aside our own bias in terms of what we think is great for climate, but may be detrimental to business. And that is 100% right. And that is one of the challenges that comes from leading an organization through its climate-related financial disclosures. So we need to help our organization balance those two things, where a business opportunity might create an increased impact on climate change, which then will create a physical risk or a transition risk on the business. And the idea of doing this risk assessment for climate change is to be able to bring those climate-related risks and opportunities to the table. Most of the time in most organizations, the only risks and opportunities that are brought to the table are the business ones, thought about in isolation. So the work that these disclosures are going to help initiate in organizations will start to bring those climate-related risks and opportunities on the table. And a couple more questions here. How would you overlay climate risk with answer D, so decrease royalties, because mining more coal equals more emissions? That's a great, I think that's again that interplay between business opportunity and risk and climate-related opportunity and risk. And this is why I've popped up here the summary of the disclosures. This is why the disclosures are asking these questions about how climate-related risks are prioritized relative to other types of risks, and I would also say opportunities, and how those processes are integrated into and inform the entity's overall risk management process. And when we talk to strategies, we'll talk to that a little bit there as well. So that's starting to help us see that this is complex, and this is why we need to engage a broad range of stakeholders in the organisation when we come to the decisions that are made once those risks have been identified. So the risk management process is really going through and saying, what are they? What are our processes for identifying climate-related risks and opportunities, and how do they integrate into the other processes that we use? When we move to the strategy session, we'll start to see how they the disclosures are expecting organisations to take those risks and opportunities and build them into their overall strategic planning process. And Orly is asking, what is the maturity level of companies implementing the climate risks in their risk profiles? I mean, I'll tell you Amanda's guess on that one, pretty low. Interestingly, the companies that have done the best job of including these in the risk profile are the companies that are most implicated, often in climate-related risks. So a lot of the big mining and resources companies are furthest ahead or most mature in this space. But I haven't seen, and again, I haven't looked at every single company's information, but I haven't really seen climate risk yet elevated to the same level as other business-related risks. Thank you for those questions. That's great. So what I've popped here is a restatement of what's expected to be included in the risk management disclosures. So again, we don't have time today to go through all of them, but what the disclosure is looking for from an entity is an understanding of the processes that were used to identify, assess, prioritize, and monitor climate-related risks and opportunities. These are the details of what's to be included in there. And you'll see down the bottom here that it's looking for a scenario analysis. So it's asking questions about whether scenario analysis was used in that process, and if so, how it informed the identification of climate-related risks and opportunities. And scenario analysis is actually the way we connect risk management to strategy, which is what we'll talk to next. It sort of sits between the two of them. And the reason that it does that is because the standards expect us to, the way that we do our scenario analysis is dependent on the level of climate-related risk. So the identification and assessment of climate-related risk needs to come first so that an entity understands what that level of risk is. And the higher the level of climate-related risk, the higher the level of technical sophistication expected in doing that scenario analysis. So once the work is done on assessing climate-related risk, an entity is then has an understanding of how much work needs to be done on the scenario analysis, which in turn informs the strategy. And that's pretty much it, I think. Let me just check there's no last questions. I'll sort of wrap up. I've got a few chats coming, but I'm not sure if they're sessions. Great. Oh, thank you, Kylie Jane. Getting some feedback there from everyone. Very happy. Thank you for your participation and engagement. I do have some more in the next session, so don't go away. But in terms of closing out risk management, I point out that what you're expected to think about as you do your risk and climate-related risk and opportunity disclosures is both the physical and transition risks and opportunities. The identification of those risks and opportunities involves that identifying the locations, going and getting data to overlay with it, and then to identify the things which are most likely to materialize. And those climate-related risks and opportunities are needed to inform disclosures under all the other disclosure areas. They will inform the level of governance or how climate is incorporated into governance. They'll inform how climate is integrated into strategic decisions, and they'll inform how climate gets reported in the metrics and targets session. So that wraps up risk management.